I'm Daniel Levine, and this is the Bio Report. Alzheimer's disease drug development has long focused on slowing memory loss, but for many families, the tipping point that makes home care impossible is not cognition, it's psychosis. Hallucinations and delusions in Alzheimer's are a distinct, prevalent, and under-recognized target for therapy. We spoke to Elizabeth Thompson, Executive Vice President and Head of R&D at Acadia Pharmaceuticals, about the biology behind psychosis in dementia, the company's experimental therapy to treat the condition in people with Alzheimer's disease, and the forces reshaping the drug development landscape to enable the development of such treatments. Liz, thanks for joining us.
Thank you. Great to be here.
We're going to talk about Alzheimer's disease, Acadia, and its efforts to advance a therapy to treat unmet needs in people with the condition. Let's start with Alzheimer's disease, though. How well understood is it, and why has it been so challenging to bring effective therapies to the market?
So, a lot of this is about complexity. Alzheimer's disease is complex itself, and this is even further complicated with overlap with other diseases that look kind of like Alzheimer's but aren't. We've now come to understand that Alzheimer's disease is really a multifactorial neurodegenerative disorder. It has genetic and non-genetic contributions. It's got different pathology underlying it. Neuroinflammation, vascular contributions. This is really just not overall a simple disease with a simple and easily understood pathway. And then it's also complex in terms of its manifestations. You can see pathology beginning years or sometimes even decades before clinical symptoms, which makes it hard to time your intervention. And so historically, trials have been focused more in later stages of the disease and maybe in one facet alone, which makes it more difficult to show benefit. There have been a lot of recent advances, and that's in terms of biomarkers that help us identify the disease earlier on, as well as better understandings of some of the underlying biology that really have come together to put us in a better place where the field really is starting to move forward now.
Drug developers often focus on slowing cognitive decline, but you're zeroing in on psychosis in Alzheimer's disease. Why do you view psychosis as just as critical a treatment target as cognition?
So a guiding light for us here at Acadia is really about delivering meaningful innovation that improves the lives of patients and caregivers in both the neuroscience and rare disease communities. And sometimes that can mean going a little bit off the beaten track. Psychosis, which is hallucinations and delusions, is actually very common, and it affects something like 30% of patients over the course of Alzheimer's disease. I should start by explaining what psychosis actually is. So it's hallucinations, which can be seeing or hearing or otherwise experiencing things that aren't actually there, or delusions, which are believing things that aren't true. And this can be anything from something pretty benign to believing that your spouse is cheating on you or that your caregiver is trying to cheat you or even hurt you. And these symptoms can be independent drivers of morbidity. They're not just a simple result of cognitive decline. Psychosis by itself is associated with faster functional deterioration. It's a huge burden on caregivers and can drive higher healthcare utilization. So cognition is incredibly important, but treating that alone doesn't address one of the most disruptive aspects of the disease for patients and for families.
Well, how does something like hallucinations or delusions in Alzheimer's change the trajectory for patients' care when it comes to things like safety, hospitalization, and time to nursing home placement?
Yeah, so to start out with, something we've seen in the Parkinson's disease space that we know to also be true here is that there is stigma and fear around even talking about psychosis. And so, unfortunately, what that means is that people don't discuss it until they hit a crisis. And these crises can really increase safety risks, wandering and paranoia and misinterpretation of caregivers' actions. So there are numerous longitudinal studies out there that link psychosis to things like increased rate of hospitalization and emergency care. In a crisis, families often call 911 because they don't know what else to do. It can lead to accelerated loss of independence. And unfortunately, it also is really a precursor to earlier placement in nursing homes. Caregivers often cite that hallucinations and delusions and the behaviors that they cause really are that tipping point that make home care just unsustainable.
Many of the current approaches to treating psychosis and dementia come with trade-offs, whether it's in the form of loss of motor function or cognition. How do you think about balancing those?
So, most of the current treatments that are available are off label antipsychotics. And so that means that they weren't developed for treating patients with psychosis related to their dementia. Usually they were developed for primary psychiatric disease. And so they do come along with things like impact on cognition, impact on gait and motor function, and they can have safety warnings in elderly patients in particular. So, what we're trying to do is look for something that addresses the hallucinations and delusions without some of the broad blockade that can compromise overall brain function. And through totality of data, we do know that inverse agonism against 5-HT2A may be able to impact psychosis without worsening motor symptoms or negatively impacting cognition. We've seen this in the context of Parkinson's population. Their motor impact is already part of the disease, so being able to avoid worsening motor symptoms in that population makes you feel pretty good that this mechanism probably is going to spare motor more broadly.
You alluded to Parkinson's. I should say Acadia has had a long history with Nuplazid, the company's marketed therapy for hallucinations and delusions associated with Parkinson's disease psychosis. You're now advancing ACP-204 for Alzheimer's disease psychosis. This is a next generation antipsychotic developed specifically for hallucinations and delusions rather than cognition itself. What is ACP-204 and how does it relate to Nuplazid from a scientific and clinical perspective?
So ACP-204, which now has a brand spiffy new generic name of remlifanserin, is a 5-HT2A inverse agonist. And we did build this to build upon our learnings from Nuplazid. So Nuplazid also impacts 5-HT2A. It is a great drug, and we're building on a strong foundation here. That said, there are some things that we knew that we wanted to do with our new molecule. The first of these is that Nuplazid does have a signal for QT prolongation. While it's not substantial at the marketed dose, in an elderly and frail patient population, you always need to be mindful of that. And it's important because it limited our ability to dose range with Nuplazid. There was a suggestion in earlier data that if we'd been able to go to higher doses, we might have seen higher efficacy because there does appear to be an exposure response relationship there. But we weren't able to go to higher doses with Nuplazid. So we're excited about the possibility that remlifanserin, where we can go to higher exposures, may have the potential for greater efficacy. We also do know that it is faster in its time to steady state, and what that could mean is that there may be quicker onset of efficacy with remlifanserin.
So you mentioned 5-HT2A. It might be a familiar receptor because of the work that's being done around the use of hallucinogens as a treatment for certain psychiatric disorders. But can you explain what 5-HT2A is and its significance when it comes to hallucinations and delusions?
So we do have good evidence, largely through studying of Nuplazid, which its generic name is pimavanserin, so I'll probably just call it pimavanserin, that suggests that that inverse agonism at 5-HT2A really can be effective in terms of managing the hallucinations and delusions. We've seen it primarily in Parkinson's disease psychosis, which of course is where pimavanserin is approved. Um, but we did study pimavanserin in a number of different areas. And so there were some suggestive data in Alzheimer's disease as well that's been sort of the underpinning of our wanting to explore remlifanserin in Alzheimer's disease psychosis.
Well, what's known about your experimental therapy from the studies you've conducted to date in Alzheimer's?
So, with remlifanserin so far, clinical development is a learning process. Our phase one program has included more than 200 participants to date, some of those healthy volunteers, some of those elderly patients. And we have two ongoing phase two trials, one in Alzheimer's disease, Alzheimer's disease psychosis, as I've mentioned before, and another in another disease state called Lewy body dementia psychosis. So far, we feel confident that we've avoided the QT prolongation that I mentioned that we saw with Nuplazid and that we have a faster time to steady state. We also feel confident that we're going to be able to explore higher doses, and we actually are doing that in our ongoing phase two trials. There are a few other things that we think are pretty important in a meaningful medicine for patients living with Alzheimer's disease, things like simple dosing. We know that dosing with remlifanserin can be once a day. We know it can be done with or without food. You can imagine it's always important for a medicine to be something that's easy for people to take and get their consistent dosing. But in this patient population in particular, the easier it is, the more likely it is that they're going to be complying with their medicine and getting the potential for benefit.
And for the phase 2 study, what are the inclusion criteria for the population, and what are the primary endpoints, and is there a biomarker strategy?
So, our phase two study for Alzheimer's disease psychosis, which is currently ongoing, and I'm excited with the fact that we potentially will be looking at data in the August to October timeframe of this year. The study is randomized, it's double blind, placebo controlled. We've got a target enrollment of a little bit over 300 patients. Our primary endpoint is something called the SAPS H&D. And basically, this is a measure that lets you specifically look at hallucinations and delusions. There are a number of different questions that ask about different types of hallucinations and delusions and the degree to which they're present. Um, in terms of biomarkers, something that's been really interesting in the Alzheimer's space just over the last few years is that we are getting better at understanding what diagnostic biomarkers look like. And that actually is now part of the clinical diagnostic process, is ensuring that people biologically have Alzheimer's disease. So our main strategy as far as biomarkers is concerned is about ensuring that these patients really do have not just clinically diagnosed Alzheimer's, but they are biomarker confirmed biological Alzheimer's patients as well.
And are these people who are suffering from delusions and hallucinations, or they're pre-symptomatic in that regard, and this is being used to prevent them from starting?
Oh, that's a great question. This is a treatment. We're not looking at it in a prophylactic manner right now. So we are requiring that people have some degree of baseline hallucination and delusion to make sure that we're able to see improvements there rather than prevention of development. Because right now, we don't have a great sense of who among the Alzheimer's population is going to go on to develop psychosis. So that's one of the things that would be really interesting to understand better. But without knowing that, it's hard to design a prevention trial.
And if the studies are successful, what kind of real world impact are you hoping for here?
Yeah, I mean, reduction in hallucinations and delusions. I talked about the impact that this has on patients. I talked about the impact that this has on caregivers. I mean, hopefully, what an effective therapy here could do is reduce the hallucinations and delusions, which would translate into potentially improved patient safety, less likelihood that they're wandering, less likelihood that they're paranoid and, afraid of what their caregivers might be doing, which is going to give you reduced caregiver stress and hopefully help patients remain at home longer. It also has the potential to reduce reliance on off-label psychotics, and overall, at end, hopefully improve quality of life for both the patients and the caregivers.
Acadia not only has Nuplazid as a commercial product, but you also brought to market the first treatment for Rett syndrome. How does having commercial experience in neurology and rare diseases shape the way you design early Alzheimer's trials?
So, in drug development, I really believe we need to start with the end in mind. So, we need to think about what's going to matter to patients, to their families, to physicians, and to payers. And this helps us design studies that can actually demonstrate those benefits if they are there. And it helps us be realistic with ourselves if the medicine that we're developing actually isn't going to make the kind of difference that matters. So I think getting that perspective of what is going to be a commercially viable drug is incredibly important to do as early in the process as you can and refine that as you go along. And there's also the sort of the flip side. As a drug developer, it matters incredibly to me that if I'm so fortunate as to be able to help develop a meaningful option for patients, that option is going to be available to those patients who need it and want it. And our commercial colleagues are an incredibly important part of making sure that happens.
If you're successful with this therapy, how do you think it might influence how clinicians think about managing neuropsychiatric symptoms and dementia more broadly?
So, I mean, I think it has the possibility of establishing Alzheimer's disease psychosis as something that's distinct and that can be treated. Um, if physicians have in hand a data package where they can understand what you could expect when you use a medicine in an Alzheimer's disease psychosis patient in particular, that's going to help them be more confident in their intervention, and it's going to help them fit the right treatment to the right patient. So I think there's a real opportunity here to help physicians feel like they've got a tool that they can use and to understand what they can expect out of it.
It seems to be we're at a time where there's growing investment in deal making in neurology and neuro rare indications. What's driving the current interest in the space, and what makes it more than just a cyclical surge?
Well, you're definitely right that drug development can be cyclical, and I think neurology has been one of those areas that has definitely been like that over time. Um, we certainly are seeing some real interest. Alzheimer's alone has been something like 15 to $20 billion in acquisitions over the last few years. A couple of last year's biggest deals were in the neuroscience area, so there is a lot of recent interest. I think part of what's driving this is that there have actually started to be some clinical and regulatory successes. They have validated some of our understanding of underlying biology. While we're not all the way there yet on things like biomarker and precision approaches, we're making real progress. And that reduces the overall belief in risk. People have historically thought of this as an incredibly risky field, and it still is, but it's getting less so. So I think that what we're seeing here is more longer term investments driven by the fact that we are making progress clinically. We are making progress in our understanding of the underlying biology and how to design trials. And overall, this is giving people some real reason to believe.
We're also seeing more creative deal structures in neuroscience, whether it's options or staged investments or risk sharing collaborations. What kinds of partnerships are most strategically important to Acadia as you advance this and other late stage neuro programs?
So I'm glad that we're in what I see as an enviable position in the sense that we don't have to do deals, but instead we can choose what we think would add real potential benefit. We're confident that we can develop and commercialize the things that are currently in our pipeline, and we have a robust mid-stage pipeline. So I think that we're well set from that perspective. But we are very interested in continuing to bring in new external innovation that really does feel Acadia sized and that we think could make a meaningful difference for underserved patient populations in either the rare or the neurology space.
And as you look ahead to potential global development and commercialization of an Alzheimer's psychosis therapy, are there regional differences you're preparing for in terms of diagnosis, reimbursement, or standards of care?
There are differences across sort of all of the above. Even within the US, there are data that suggests there's up to a twofold difference in diagnosis rates for Alzheimer's just based on geography, not underlying risk factors. And so when you expand that thinking out over the globe, that's substantial and can be further compounded by cultural differences around psychosis and the potential stigma. We talked about the fact that there aren't great current options. Standard of care, therefore, is fairly fragmented. Different regions approach this differently. And there are, of course, different specialist paradigms and different reimbursement paradigms across regions. So, globally, what I'd say is that Alzheimer's disease psychosis is under-recognized, inconsistently managed, and a major driver of burden at both the individual and the societal level. And preparing for regional differences is going to be about meeting the healthcare systems where they are and hopefully raising the standard of care everywhere.
Liz Thompson, Executive Vice President and Head of R&D for Acadia. Liz, thanks so much for your time today.
Thank you. Just a pleasure.
Thanks for listening. The Bio Report is a production of the Levine Media Group. To automatically download this podcast each week, subscribe to our RSS feed or through iTunes or other podcast manager. To join our mailing list, go to levinemediagroup.com. We'd love to hear from you. If you want to drop us a line or are interested in sponsoring this podcast, send an email to danny@levinemediagroup.com. Special thanks to Jonah Levine, who composed our theme music, and the Jonah Levine Collective, which performs it.